They told you masculinity was toxic. You nodded, stayed silent, and thought you were doing the right thing. But what if you were being played in the most sophisticated psychological game ever designed? You sit through the diversity training session, quietly agreeing as the instructor explains how traditional masculinity has harmed the world. Around you, other men shift uneasily, but keep their mouths shut. They've learned that questioning this new truth only makes them the problem. They've been conditioned to believe their instincts, strength, competition, dominance, taking risks, control of emotions, are forms of evil. The women in the room nod approvingly. They've redefined masculinity into something softer, more compliant, something that serves their vision of balance. And the men? They've learned to apologize for existing. Meanwhile, those same women ascend the hierarchies once built and led by men. What you're witnessing isn't just cultural change. It's the endgame of the most effective political coup in history. No armies, no laws, just a slow, relentless reprogramming of manhood itself. The rule book of masculinity has been rewritten, not by men who admire it, but by those who compete against it. And tragically, men have agreed to play by their rivals' rules. For 50 years, we've seen the systematic reconstruction of masculine identity by individuals who've never lived masculinity themselves. All characteristics that rendered men effective competitors: aggression, stoicism, dominance, taking risks, control of emotions, have been pathologized as dysfunctional, primitive, or damaging. This reinterpretation was not an accident. It was calculated. If you cannot beat somebody head-on in competition, you alter the game rules. When you cannot overcome somebody physically, you psych them. When you cannot compete with somebody's natural strengths, you persuade them that their strengths are weaknesses. The brilliance of this strategy is its moral framing. Rather than acknowledging that they desired to undermine male competition, the makers of this movement packaged their agenda as assisting men in becoming better men. They persuade men that accepting feminine-defined masculinity would make them more desirable, more prosperous, and more satisfied. The consequence is a multitude of men who have assimilated a definition of masculinity invented by their adversaries. They've taken on the acceptance that their inherent nature is erroneous, their body-based urges are flawed, and their conventional function is out of date. They're attempting to triumph in a game on terms set by their opponents, so they'll lose. This psychological colonization is the ultimate triumph over a rival group. Not only have these men lost, they've been persuaded to engage in their own loss under the impression that they're progressing. Contemporary gender relations are practiced under the guise of collaboration while actually constituting the fiercest competition in the history of human relations. Women haven't retreated from challenging men. They've intruded into every domain where men previously ruled and insisted on being treated no worse, or, if possible, better than men in those domains. This produces a zero-sum dynamic in which women's advances come at men's expense. Each leadership row occupied by a woman is a slot closed to a man. Each scholarship, promotion, or chance allocated to women is a chance denied to men. Each policy used to benefit women necessarily harms men. But this competition has been masked as cooperation through rhetoric that frames female advancement as advantageous for all. Men are instructed that female leadership will make organizations more well-rounded. Male bastions are framed as in need of diversity instead of being invaded by competitors. Policies that overtly benefit women are referred to as equality initiatives instead of competitive advantages. The men who identify this competitive reality are described as threatened, insecure, or resistant to progress. The women who are going after this strategy are hailed as courageous pioneers battling oppression. The framework of the narrative renders it impossible to recognize what's really occurring without being branded as the villain. This competition camouflaging has been so effective that many men do not even know they are competing. They believe they are advancing progress, when in fact they are paying for their own displacement. The reconstruction of masculinity could not have worked without the cooperation of lower status men who thought they stood to benefit by joining women's interests against higher status men. These men became willing agents of undermining the systems that had privileged their more successful rivals. This coalition succeeded because it offered these men something they could not otherwise gain in traditional masculine competition: approval from women, moral superiority, and an opportunity to undermine the men who had outcompeted them. Rather than working to become better at competing in order to do better, they decided to revise the rules in order to make traditional masculine success impossible. The lower status men who entered into this coalition felt that they were placing themselves well for a new social hierarchy, in which feminine-approved actions would be rewarded. They felt that by abandoning toxic masculinity and adopting healthy masculinity, they would be more desirable to women and more successful in feminized institutions. This math was essentially erroneous in that it took for granted that feminine-defined masculinity was intended to serve men, not dominate them. These men did not realize that they were only of use to this movement as long as they were assisting in the deconstruction of traditional masculine structures of power. Once that was done with, they would be disposable. The coalition of women and lower status men managed to marginalize traditionally masculine men. But it was always a short-term alliance to be used to further female interests and not male interests. The reconstruction of masculinity depended on three main emotional manipulation techniques that avoided logical analysis and directly addressed male psychological vulnerabilities. Knowing these techniques explains how well men's own safeguarding mechanisms were turned against themselves.
The initial strategy took advantage of male protective impulses by making displays of female weakness and victimhood. Men were presented with countless examples of how traditional masculinity allegedly hurt women, provoking feelings of guilt and obligation for problems they had not caused. This triggered male wishes to serve and protect, and made men open to giving up their own interests in order to avoid female misery. The second strategy employed female approval as a reward system for male adherence to new standards of masculinity. Men who adopted feminist-endorsed behaviors were rewarded with praise, validation, and promises of female attraction. This generated strong incentives for men to leave behind traditional masculine attributes in favor of those behaviors women purported to desire. The third tactic used shame and social exclusion to sanction men who pushed back against the new definitions of masculinity. Men who challenged female-defined masculinity were stigmatized as insecure, threatened, sexist, or psychologically scarred. Social penalty generated intense pressure to conform in order not to be grouped with socially unacceptable male prototypes. These manipulation techniques were most effective because they seemed to provide men with healthy alternatives to traditional masculinity while secretly eroding the character traits that had enabled men to be successful competitors through all of human history. Perhaps the most insightful part of the Masculine Redefinition Project is the gulf between what women claim to desire from men and what they actually react positively to in their own relationships. Women have managed to persuade men to use behaviors women say they like while being sexually attracted to men who pay no attention to these rules at all. The men who internalized feminist-sanctioned masculinity most fully tend to be romantically unsuccessful with the same stability of women who advocated these ideals. Men who retain traditional masculine qualities are, however, sexually successful while being in violation of every tenet of evolved masculinity. This paradox arises because redescription of masculinity was never intended to render men more desirable to women. It was intended to render men less competitive in social and professional status hierarchies. Women's sexual desire still reacts to conventional indicators of male achievement, dominance, and genetic health, no matter what women consciously assert to appreciate. The disparity between declared desires and revealed desires proves that the masculine redefinition project is for female competitive interests, not female romantic interests. Women gain from having less traditionally masculine men vying for resources and status, but are nonetheless drawn to men who preserve those characteristics in spite of social pressure. This forms a vicious trap for men who feel that adopting female-created masculinity would enhance their romantic success. They've been persuaded to drop the very things that create female attraction, while being assured that dropping those things would make them more desirable. The remaking of masculinity was amplified by systematic capture of social institutions tasked with socializing young men. Educational institutions, mental health models, corporate policies, and media portrayals all started to propagate the same messages regarding toxic traditional masculinity and healthy alternative masculinity. This institutional alignment forced men to receive the same message in each area of their lives. Schools instructed boys that aggressive competition was antisocial. Therapists diagnosed traditional masculine behavior as psychological disorders. Corporations mandated policies that punished masculine leadership. Media routinely depicted stereotypically masculine men as the bad guys, while embracing feminized male characters. Institutional capture worked especially well because it started with young boys who did not have enough experience or brain development to analyze critically what they were told. Whole generations of men grew up thinking that their naturally masculine behaviors were indications of moral or psychological inadequacy. These institutions were seized not by conspiracy, but by the incremental installation of individuals with a similar ideological commitment in positions of power. Over time, these institutions became self-reinforcing systems that rewarded anti-masculine messaging and punished dissonant. The end result is a society in which traditional masculinity has been officially delegitimized and replaced by alternative masculinity as the educated, evolved, and morally superior option. The most pernicious effect of masculine redefinition is the deliberate exclusion of qualified men from leadership positions in favor of individuals selected on the basis of ideological conformity instead of merit. Such organizations and institutions become symbolic as opposed to functional representations. Once competence is relegated to second place in favor of compliance with ideologically determined standards, institutional performance suffers thereby. Organizations that are headed by individuals selected for their willingness to adopt endorsed narratives instead of their capacity to deliver results become increasingly ineffective at fulfilling their declared missions. This competence crisis goes beyond the individual organization to spread to the entirety of industries within society. With meritocratic selection having been substituted by ideological selection, the general quality of leadership and decision-making deteriorates in all institutions involved. The men who get ousted from these roles aren't so much replaced with more capable women. They get replaced by individuals who are better at managing ideological demands than pragmatic difficulties. This produces leadership classes that are adept at maintaining conformity to narratives, but lacking in the ability to resolve hard problems. Its long-term effects will be realized as institutions are challenged in ways that necessitate real capability over symbolic representation to combat effectively. If you're just starting to get it about how the redefinition of manliness has systematically undermined male competition while masquerading this undermining as moral advancement, be sure to subscribe and that notification bell. What I'm sharing today shatters basic premises about gender advancement that most folks never even consider questioning. And there is plenty more to discuss regarding the true agendas of social movements that purport to assist the groups that they're actually depleting. The project of redefining manliness called for persuading men that their traditional advantages were not earned, but illegitimate. This called for constructing a narrative in which male success was redefined as male privilege, male competence was redefined as male dominance, and male achievement was redefined as male oppression. This process of manufacturing guilt was necessary because men had to be persuaded to give up voluntarily advantages that they had rightfully achieved through superior performance. Direct confrontation would not have worked, since men could have just refused to collaborate. Psychological manipulation was needed to get men to be accomplices to their own displacement. The guilt narrative taught that all male benefit came at the cost of female opportunity, that all male success undercut female potential, and that all male achievement perpetuated systemic female oppression. This generated moral pressure on men to vacate positions to right past wrongs they individually had never perpetrated. Men who challenged the narrative of guilt were informed that their resistance indicated their privilege, their defensiveness affirmed their complicity, and their objections showed their stake in oppressive structures. This self-referential argument created a situation in which it was impossible to counter the narrative of guilt without seeming to legitimize it.
The production of male guilt was especially successful because it played upon male codes of honor that involved responsibility, fairness, and defending the weak. These desirable masculine virtues were used to establish compliance with a program that ultimately worked against masculinity as a whole. The success of masculine redefinition was highly contingent on enlisting men to be spokesmen for their own displacement. These male supporters lent validity to anti-masculine messages and showed that progressive men were on board with the cause. These men actually believed that they were working towards justice, equality, and advancement. They weren't aware of being useful agents for a competitive tactic aimed at dismantling male competition for resources and status. Their genuine belief made them better spokespeople than women could have been for the same cause. The male sponsors who championed feminist-defined masculinity were recompensed with female approval, social standing within progressive communities, and the psychological gratification of moral superiority to other men. These benefits made their participation feel self-serving, even as they worked female competitive interests. Most of these men learned too late that their sponsorship of anti-masculine movements offered only short-term gains. After serving their function of justifying assaults on masculinity, they were subject to the same judgments and exclusions as other men. The men who most willingly espoused their own replacement usually became casualties of the very movements that they advanced. Their masculinity rendered them suspect ideologically, where masculinity was seen as inherently problematic. At the center of the masculine redefinition program was denial of essential biological differences between women and men that had created classic gender roles. Denial was required because acceptance of biological differences would have legitimated classic masculine privileges. The movement encouraged the notion that all differences based on gender were socially constructed. Biological sex was unimportant to capability, and that differences found in men and women stemmed from socialization and not genetics. This model rendered traditional masculine characteristics random instead of useful. This biological denial went against massive scientific fact regarding hormonal differences, brain structure dissimilarities, physical capability disparities, and psychological tendency trends between sexes. But this denial was made politically and socially unthinkable in institutions taken over by the redefinition movement. The result of biological denial was the establishment of policies and expectations that dismissed actual differences between men and women while penalizing recognition of these differences. This established systems that did not function well because they were constructed on ideological presuppositions rather than empirical facts. Men who held on to traditional masculine conduct were defined as resisting changing more than their biological hardwiring, while women who did poorly in traditionally masculine positions were aided by accommodations that recognized the very differences the ideology asserted did not exist. The redefinition of masculinity worked as an economic function by providing rationale for male displacement in educational and career settings. When traditional masculine characteristics were pathologized, institutions were able to adopt policies that routinely penalized men in a systematic way while asserting moral legitimacy. School systems that punished competitive behavior, aggressive striving for achievement, and independent thought naturally selected against traditionally masculine students while rewarded compliant, collaborative students. This created pipeline effects that decreased male representation in higher education and professional training. Professional settings that encouraged collaborative leadership, emotional intelligence, and inclusive communication developed advancement criteria that rewarded feminine-coded behaviors but punished masculine-coded behaviors. This increasingly hampered traditionally masculine men from reaching the top. The economic displacement was legitimated by stories of righting historical wrongs, making more effective organizations, and building stronger leadership. However, the actual effect was moving economic opportunity from men to women by deliberate policy shifts. This displacement placed a huge economic burden on men to choose feminine-sanctioned behavior or risk career constraints. Most men opted to comply rather than express themselves truthfully because they could not pay the economic price of defiance. The Masculine Redefinition Project was a revolution of culture that attempted to revolutionize society by altering the fundamental building block of social organization from traditional gender roles to ideologically sanctioned gender performances. This revolution needed to eliminate traditional masculine culture and replace it with feminine-sanctioned alternatives. Traditional male spaces were breached, traditional male activities were altered to encompass women, and traditional male values were replaced with female-preferred options. The Cultural Revolution was achieved through apparently small changes that added up to profound transformations. Language was altered to remove masculine defaults. Traditions were revised to become more inclusive. Practices were reformed to be less competitive. Each change appeared reasonable, although the collective impact was revolutionary. Men who protested these cultural changes were portrayed as holding on to outmoded traditions, opposing needed progress, or justifying systems that hurt others. This rendered cultural resistance look like a reactionary and self-centered activity in place of legitimate preservation of priceless social forms. Its success relied on presenting traditional masculine culture to be morally unacceptable while presenting feminine-approved culture to seem patently superior to any sensible individual. Arguably the most deepening impact of the Masculine Redefinition Project was psychological emasculation of men who bought into feminist-approved masculinity. These men learned to doubt their own instincts, subdue their natural responses, and solicit permission for genuinely masculine desires. This psychological emasculation produced men who were uncertain of their own worth, confused about their social position, and reliant on outside validation for their sense of self. They grew psychologically vulnerable because they had been severed from their natural sources of masculine confidence and purpose. The emasculated men that this process yielded tended to suffer from depression, anxiety, and relationship issues, since they had been conditioned to stifle the very characteristics that would have served them well in these capacities. They were attempting to act as men, but responding to directives aimed at inhibiting masculine success. This psychological harm was especially bad, since it was self-inflicted by earnest efforts to be improved men by feminine-defined criteria. The men under this emasculation could not comprehend why obeying sanctioned rules was making them less successful and less contented with life. The psychological emasculation was most likely the most cruelest feature of the whole project, as it led men to believe their agony was proof of their moral development and not the expected effect of deviating from their nature. The final aim of masculine redefinition was never to produce improved men or healthier relationships. It was to decrease male competition for resources, status, and leadership roles by persuading men to give up competitive attitudes and behaviors voluntarily. This tactic worked astonishingly well in the short term. Traditionally masculine men were disqualified from competition by social pressure, organizational policies, and psychological manipulation. This opened the door for women and acquiescent men to move into positions formerly held by more traditionally masculine rivals.
But the endgame of competition shows a basic deficiency in this strategy. The feminized men and women who become these positions frequently lack the competence, drive, and resilience that had made their predecessors successful. This produced leadership deficits within institutions and organizations throughout society. The elimination of competent masculine leadership produced vacuum effects that were replaced by less capable alternatives. This served short-term competitive needs, but it impaired the long-term functionality of the institutions being captured. The endgame of competition also showed that most of the men who had been helpful partners in deconstructing traditional masculinity were expendable as soon as the job was done. They found that their partnership with anti-masculine causes gave them only short-term shield against the same powers they had helped unleash. Reconstructing masculinity has established unstable equilibrium conditions that will necessarily create corrective feedback. When institutions repeatedly choose for ideological conformity rather than competence, they open themselves up to competition from organizations that are focused on performance rather than narrative orthodoxy. This correction will happen through a number of different mechanisms. Economic competition will reward organizations with the most competent individuals regardless of their compliance with approved standards of masculinity. International competition will benefit those societies that have not undermined their most competent members through ideological manipulation. Generational change will most likely yield young men rejecting the unsuccessful promises of feminine-sanctioned masculinity. Correction could also be obtained through societal acknowledgement that the masculine redefinition initiative has yielded net negative outcomes to society. With the increasing prevalence of the competence crisis and institutional performance in steady decline, there could be renewed respect for conventional masculine capabilities and characteristics. Yet this correction will meet with a lot of opposition from individuals and institutions that have a vested interest in the existing system. The correction will necessitate men to reassert their right to define masculinity on their terms as it relates to their own nature and interests, instead of adopting definitions from their competitors. The men who are able to navigate this correction successfully will be those who maintain their masculine authenticity in the face of social pressure, acquired competence in the face of institutional bias, and retain their competitive drive in the face of efforts to pathologize it. Creating a new reality for men has been one of the most successful competitive strategies in human history. By inducing men to relinquish their natural advantages while thinking they were developing morally, this movement won victories that direct combat could never have won. The men who were taken in by this tactic didn't lose because they were stupid or weak. They lost because they were decent, honorable, and actually interested in fairness and justice. These good characteristics were used skillfully to promote interests that ultimately work against their own success and well-being. Comprehending this manipulation is the beginning of immunity. Men who understand that conforming to rules scripted by their competitors means their failure can start making decisions for their own interests instead of their competitors' preference. The project of redefinition worked because it made men believe that their nature was the issue and not that throwing away their nature was the trap. True masculinity does not require validation from individuals who are in competition with masculinity. It requires only the bravery to simply be and to be seen and heard beyond the expectations to conform to alien standards. The men who escape this psychological prison are those who understand that being a man means defining manhood according to masculine nature rather than accepting definitions created by people who benefit from masculine weakness. If this analysis of how masculine redefinition has systematically weakened male competition, while disguising this agenda as moral progress, has helped you understand the forces operating against authentic masculinity, subscribe to this channel for more analysis of the covert forces that control contemporary society. Hit that notification bell because recognizing the manipulation tactics might liberate you from psychological conditioning to advance other people's interests at your own cost. Share this video with any men who must realize that obeying rules penned by your competitors is the most assured way to lose. The guys who will do well in this setting are the ones who understand that authenticity involves resisting the outside definitions of who they ought to be and instead being who they really are.